I'm the guy they call when the AC dies in August, when the fire alarm won't reset, when the client's flight is delayed and they suddenly need a quiet room and decent coffee in 10 minutes. I know where the spare keys are, which outlet in the back hallway is cursed, and exactly how much it costs us every hour when that glass-walled conference room sits empty. Our office is my ecosystem. I negotiated the lease, staged the tour for the execs, fought for the budget to build the kitchen everyone now pretends just kinda happened. So when I say I didn't know they'd sold it, I mean no one even thought I deserved a courtesy email. We're a mid-sized tech company, the kind that thinks enterprise because the logo slides well into a deck, but still has people using sticky notes to remember the Wi-Fi password. Headquarters is in another city with a view of a river and a lobby full of plants. I run one of the regional offices in a cheaper market, the one that quietly hits targets and doesn't make a lot of noise. We are the boring bar on the revenue chart that keeps going up. The building we were in wasn't fancy, but it was ours. 2 floors, decent parking, actual walls instead of one big echo chamber, a server closet that didn't double as a broom cupboard. Years ago, before I got the manager title, I sat in on the final lease meetings because I was the only one who understood both our headcount projections and where people would physically sit. Our CFO at the time joked that if I ever left, they'd have to sell the place because no one else knew how it worked. That old CFO retired last year. In his place, we got Nate. Nate arrived like a LinkedIn post walked into our lobby. Tailored suits, no tie, tan that never faded, and a smile that said he'd practiced it in front of 3 different ring lights. His first all-hands slide deck had more pictures of himself than of actual numbers. "We're not a software company," he said, pacing like a TED Talk. "We're a transformation company. We need to look like the kind of business people imagine when they hear 9 figures." The same week he said that, he asked me to freeze discretionary spending in my office. No more Friday lunches, no more offsites that weren't client-facing, push promotions 6 months where possible, tighten travel. The email looked like a suggestion. The budget sheet looked like an ultimatum. I'm not the type to fight over snacks, so I did what I always do. Ran the numbers, moved a few things around, explained to my team that macro headwinds were making everyone cautious. People grumbled, but they understood. We'd had slow quarters before. We'd lived through worse. What stuck in my head wasn't the cuts. It was a line Nate slipped into that first town hall. "We're going to make our capital work harder. Dead assets don't build futures. We're exploring a more dynamic property strategy." I remember because I wrote it down and underlined it twice. Property is my world. Desks, square footage, emergency exits, lease clauses. If they were going to touch the building, someone should talk to the guy who could tell you which window leaked in heavy rain. No one did. A couple of weeks later, I was reviewing our meeting room calendar and noticed our CEO had a block of time with Nate and someone from a firm I didn't recognize. Subject line, asset monetization or property strategy. I hovered over the file icon in the invite. No attachments for me. I wasn't on the list. I told myself it was probably about HQ. Our building is nice, sure, but the main office is the one with an atrium and a lobby water feature. If anyone was going to get optimized, it'd be the expensive address. Life went on in the way offices do. People argued over the thermostat. The espresso machine died and then resurrected when someone unplugged it and plugged it back in. One of our devs brought his dog in on a Friday, and half the floor pretended they weren't getting less done. In between, we shipped work, answered emails at dumb hours, and kept clients happy enough to sign renewals. There's this thing my team says a lot, usually when a production deploy goes sideways or a client decides they suddenly want a feature yesterday. "At least the building's solid," they joke. "They can take the bonuses, but they can't take the roof." I used to smile at that. I liked knowing that for once the ground under us wasn't moving. The day that changed, it started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. I was in my office going through vendor contracts when my desk phone lit up with an unknown local number. 90% of those are people trying to sell us office supplies we don't need. I let it ring twice, sighed, and picked up. "Hi, is this Grant Cooper?" The voice asked, polite, a little too crisp. "Speaking." "This is Martin from Ridgeway Property Group. We handle facilities for the building at 14th and Maple. I wanted to confirm your on-site contact for keycard access and discuss some updates to the parking allocation. We've been in 14th and Maple for 6 years. Our property manager has a name, a face, and an addiction to those tiny yogurt drinks. This guy wasn't him. I thought Turner Properties handled our building, I said. We've always dealt with them. There was a tiny pause on the line. Right. Turner was the previous owner's management company, he said carefully. Ridgeway represents the new ownership group. The sale closed 2 weeks ago. You weren't informed? I turned my chair slowly toward the window, watching my team move around on the floor below, ear pinned to a conversation that suddenly felt like it had left me behind. No, I said, we were not. He apologized the way people do when they're reading from a script. Something about transition, updated documentation, their desire to be a good partner. I wrote down his name, his email, the phrase new ownership group in letters so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. When I hung up, my hand was shaking, which annoyed me. The first thing I did was sanity check myself. Maybe this was some nuance of property services versus owner of record that I'd missed. I opened the folder on our shared drive where we keep facilities docs, original lease, amendments, fire inspection reports, the boring skeleton of the place. There was a new file in there. Leaseback amendment, 14th and Maple, executed. Date stamped 12 days ago. I clicked it. It wasn't Turner's logo anymore. It was Ridgeway's. The language was boilerplate if you've read enough of these. Assignment, transfer, new landlord, existing tenant obligations survive. But buried 3 pages in was the part that made my chest tighten. Whereas landlord, having acquired the property located at 14th and Maple, does hereby agree to lease back the premises to tenant under the following adjusted terms. Adjusted terms. Higher base rent after year 1, reduced dedicated parking spots, a new clause about flexibility to reconfigure space in alignment with tenants' future headcount. I scrolled to the signature page. CEO's name, Nate's name. No one from my side of the world. It was like reading a birth certificate where someone had quietly swapped the parents. I sat there in my small glass box, staring at the digital signatures, and for a second, all I could think about was Anna from support, who had cried in my office last quarter because her cost of living bump got pushed so we could preserve optionality. We told people the company couldn't afford certain things right now. Apparently that didn't apply to the dirt under their feet. My inbox pinged. A new email from Events, Ours, Ellison PR. The agency Nate had name-dropped in passing a few times. Subject line, CFO launch experience, budget draft, internal only. I shouldn't have been on it. I realized a second later why I was. Someone had copied all office contacts for venue logistics, and my name lives in every facilities list we have. Please find attached the preliminary budget for the launch event celebrating Nate Wallace's appointment as Chief Financial Officer and the unveiling of our new financial vision, the email said. Total estimated cost, $103,180 inclusive of venue, production, catering, entertainment, and content capture. I opened the spreadsheet, line items stacked neatly. Venue rental, AV production, custom stage design, branded installations, a video crew, a live jazz trio, VIP transportation, influencer outreach. One cell at the bottom, in bold, rounded it all up to a number that was almost exactly what we used to keep in a reserve fund for emergency repairs. I looked from that number back to the leaseback document. Same portion of the screen, different kind of reality. Somewhere 1,500 miles away, a man who'd been in our company for less than 6 months had sold the building my people called their second home and turned the first chunk of that money into a party for himself. I'd spent years making sure the lights stayed on. I learned that day they were willing to sell the ceiling without even telling the guy holding the ladder. The next morning, I walked into the office with a knot in my stomach. The kind you get before a meeting you can't avoid and already know won't go your way. My team was doing their usual morning shuffle. Coats off, laptops up, someone banging the printer tray because it jams if you load more than 20 sheets. None of them knew the floor under us didn't technically belong to us anymore. That knowledge sat on me like a weight, heavier with every step toward my manager's office. He was already there, coffee in hand, scanning 2 monitors the way people do when they want to pretend they're too busy to talk. I closed the door behind me. He didn't look up. "We sold 14th and Maple," I said. That got his attention. His shoulders stiffened before his face did. "Where did you hear that?" "From the new property manager," I answered, "and from the executed leaseback file someone left on our shared drive." "When were you planning to loop me in?" He dragged a hand down his face. Slow, practiced, tired, not guilty. Just annoyed I'd forced the conversation. "Grant, look, this is a strategic capital move. The board signed off. Finance needed liquidity for initiatives." "Which initiatives?" I asked. I already knew one of them. I just wanted to hear him say it. He didn't. "High-level ones. You don't need the details." "My office is literally one of the assets you sold," I said. "If there were ever a time when details mattered—" "Grant," he cut in, tone softening into something managerial and patronizing. "Nothing changes for your day-to-day. You keep managing operations. The team stays. We continue hitting targets. This is just a financial restructuring." "Sure," I said. "And the $100,000 restructuring at the downtown venue next month. How does that fit into the picture?" His eyes flickered. Not denial, not surprise, just irritation that I had the number. "That's a corporate event," he said carefully. "Part of a broader investor relations strategy. You weren't supposed to receive those drafts." "But I did," I replied. "The timing is hard to ignore." He leaned forward. "Listen, the optics aren't ideal, I agree. But you need to stay aligned. We can't have regional leads spreading panic. Your job is to keep your people steady, not fan speculation." There it was, the part that bothered me more than the sale, more than the party, more than the smugness in Nate's voice whenever he said words like vision and trajectory. They didn't want leadership. They wanted compliance. "No problem," I said. "I won't spread panic. I'll tell them what's written in the leaseback amendment. Reduced parking, new rent escalation, flexible reconfiguration." His jaw tightened. "Grant, come on. You know we need the messaging controlled." "Messaging?" I repeated. "We sold the ground they stand on. That's not messaging. That's reality." The conversation ended the same way many corporate conversations do, with him dismissing me gently, assuring me that once the broader narrative solidifies, everything would make sense. It already made sense. They needed money to look bigger than they were, and my office was the easiest thing to pawn. That afternoon, HR sent me a packet labeled Talking Points for Location Updates. It instructed me to emphasize growth, efficiency, and strategic modernization. Not once did it mention the sale. Not once did it mention the new lease terms. It didn't even say the word rent. I closed the document, walked out to the main floor, and called an impromptu meeting. My team gathered around, mugs in hand, expecting another budget update or a client escalation. "We're moving floors," I said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon." Faces tensed. Someone whispered, "Here we go." "We're getting shifted to the shared side," I continued. "Fewer dedicated desks, parking changes, new landlord." "New what?" someone asked. "Ownership changed," I said plainly. 2 weeks ago, we're now tenants, not owners." The room went still. Not loud still. The quiet kind that sits in your lungs. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I told them exactly what I knew, exactly what I didn't, and exactly what the new space would be like. Smaller, tighter, noisier. One of the devs asked if this meant their promised raises were gone. Another asked about hiring freezes. Someone else muttered something about how there's always money for the top. There was bitterness in the room, but not at me. When the meeting ended, people lingered, not to argue, but because they didn't want to go back to pretending everything was normal. Later that day, an email from Events Ellison PR hit my inbox again. I wasn't supposed to be copied, but because I was still listed as facilities lead, anything involving building logistics hit my name automatically. Subject: request for loading dock access for CFO launch rehearsal. Loading dock, the one I coordinated. The one still technically under my oversight, even though the building no longer belonged to us. Attached was a revised spreadsheet. The number at the bottom had gone up. I forwarded nothing. I screenshotted nothing. I simply saved the files the way anyone doing due diligence on facilities operations would. At 5, I was asked to join a prep call for a culture alignment session. I joined, muted, and listened as Nate talked about projecting stability externally and maintaining narrative cohesion internally. At one point, someone suggested looping me into comms to help sell the modernization story to the regional team. Nate responded before anyone else could. Grant has operational strengths, he said. He's not customer-facing enough for narrative work. Let's keep messaging centralized. I didn't react, not outwardly. Inside, something quiet and steady clicked into place, the kind of click you hear right before a breaker flips. They didn't want me in the room. Fine. Rooms have doors, and doors have paperwork. That night, I walked the floor alone, lights low, the building humming the way it always had. But it didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt borrowed, temporary, something they could trade again if the next flashy idea needed funding. As I passed the old conference room, the one with the whiteboard scar from the time a marker exploded during a sprint planning, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked like someone still trying to protect a place the company had already abandoned. That was the moment irritation turned into clarity. Not anger, not revenge. Just the understanding that if they weren't going to protect the people here, someone else would have to. And if the CFO thought he owned the narrative, he was about to learn he'd mistaken silence for agreement. You learn a lot about a company by watching who panics when nothing looks wrong yet. After my conversation with HR and that little performance Nate gave during the alignment call, I started paying attention to the quiet things, the approvals that usually came instantly but now sat unclicked, the Slack messages typed and deleted by finance analysts who suddenly looked like they were swallowing secrets, the shift in tone whenever someone said the word leaseback. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't need accomplices. I needed facts. And facts were everywhere, sitting in inboxes, hiding in SharePoint folders mislabeled Archive Do Not Modify, buried inside budget cells someone forgot to lock. Not confidential, not restricted, just overlooked, just like my office had been. The first thing I pulled was the old lease. It wasn't exciting, but it showed how stable our costs had been for years. Then I placed it next to the new amendment. Rent jumps, penalties, parking cuts, the clause that basically allowed the landlord to reorganize us like furniture. I highlighted the differences, printed both, and kept them in a plain manila folder. Anyone looking would have thought I was preparing for a renovation. The next pieces came from finance. A former colleague named Miles had moved to a logistics firm last year, but we still grabbed beers occasionally. He's the kind of guy who can explain a balance sheet to a toddler and make the toddler feel smart. I called him after work, told him I needed help understanding something hypothetically. He laughed. Grant, nothing about corporate finance is hypothetical. Send me what you've got. I never sent him proprietary data, just generic numbers, categories, capital structures. He walked me through how a CFO might bury a large, one-time event, cost under strategic capex or investor relations, how sale leasebacks look clean on paper, a burst of cash up front, A subtle bleed later. If someone wants to impress a board fast, he said, this playbook is exactly what they'd use. But if the board ever looks too closely, it collapses. That was the first moment I felt something like momentum. Inside the office, the pressure showed in other ways. Clients were the ones who noticed the space downgrade first. One of our biggest accounts, a medical device company with extremely picky executives, visited for a quarterly review and immediately asked why they were meeting in a temporary flex suite instead of the conference room with the frosted glass they loved. Their account manager, Leah, pulled me aside afterward. They're pissed, she whispered. They already asked if we're having financial issues. What am I supposed to tell them? Tell them the company is rebalancing assets, I said. It'll calm them for a week. A week? She repeated. Grant, these people talk directly to our board. If they think we're unstable, it's over. That stopped me. How directly? I asked. One of their VPs knows a board member. They were college roommates or something. A clean, realistic connection. Exactly the kind companies forget about when they assume power flows only downward. A week later, Leah came back. They're asking for transparency, not marketing lines. The real reason we moved. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. That the office sale wasn't my team's decision, that the move was forced, that I was doing what I could to stabilize morale. She stared at me for a long moment, then said, I'm telling them that. They deserve the truth. In any other context, I would have stopped her. But the people who were supposed to protect the company had already gambled with our stability. The only thing left to protect was the truth. With every document I added to my folder, the event invoice, the internal finance memos about cost alignment, the calendar invites for CFO visibility campaign, the picture sharpened. The sale proceeds weren't being used to expand teams or upgrade systems. They were feeding an image, a brand, a man who wanted to be seen as the architect of our future before he'd built anything except a party. I didn't go to the event rehearsals, but I overheard enough from facilities staff to know it was becoming a circus. Custom lighting rigs, a stage backdrop printed in New York, because the local vendor doesn't understand luxury branding. Those costs alone were more than what we'd cut from our department for the entire quarter. The night before the event, the final invoice hit the finance queue. Normally, it would have gone straight to a random analyst who'd click approve without looking too hard, but because the venue requested loading dock coordination, I was copied automatically. It wasn't sabotage. It was the same operations oversight I'd had for years. The invoice had everything listed cleanly, legally, stupidly. $103,580 for a single evening. And next to executive sponsor, displayed proudly like a trophy, was Nate's full name. I didn't edit it, didn't forward it to anyone inside my team. I simply added it to the folder, the one I'd begun organizing like a case file. When I drafted the email to the audit committee, I wasn't angry. I wasn't righteous. I was precise. I outlined timelines, attached contracts, explained the operational impact, cited client concerns, quantified retention risk, and asked, calmly, whether the board had been briefed that the building sale was tied to a discretionary executive branding initiative. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't tell a story. I asked questions every board is legally obligated to answer. I scheduled the email to send an hour before the event began. On the night of the party, the office was mostly dark. I stayed late, finishing the seat map for the upcoming floor consolidation, labeling Ethernet lines, tying up loose ends for a move none of us wanted. Somewhere across town, 100 people were drinking champagne under lights paid for with the roof above my team. When my email finally delivered, I didn't get a notification. I didn't get a response. Boards don't write back to mid-level managers. But around 9 p.m., a calendar hold appeared on the shared executive calendar. Audit Committee, emergency session. 30 minutes later, a second hold appeared. CFO required. The next morning, finance was whispering before they'd even finished unlocking their laptops. Someone had requested access logs. Someone else had pulled expense reports. A director walked past with his jaw clenched tight enough to crack. No accusation, no shouting. Just pressure. The quiet, methodical kind that means a system has begun to turn on the person who thought he controlled it. If Nate had built the party to prove how powerful he was, he should have thought harder before putting his name on every receipt. By Monday morning, the event photos were everywhere. Polished shots of Nate under stage lights, champagne flutes, a branded arch that cost as much as our entire hardware refresh budget. The internal newsletter called it a milestone evening. No one in my office mentioned it. People worked like they were waiting for a storm they could already smell, even if no one could see the clouds yet. At 11:30, a company-wide email went out. Subject line, Organizational Update. Short, almost suspiciously short. Effective immediately, Nathan Wallace has chosen to pursue new opportunities. We thank him for his leadership and wish him well. No farewell tour, no quote, no retrospective. Just a clean corporate obituary with all the emotion of a tax form. In HQ, they pretended nothing was unusual. In my office, the silence broke instantly. Already? Someone whispered. That was fast, someone else said. No one looked at me. They didn't need to. They already knew I wouldn't say a word. 2 hours later, finance sent a second announcement. A temporary freeze on non-essential capital initiatives, pending a board review. A polite way of saying, stop spending money like you're printing it. People began connecting the dots, quietly, privately, the way employees do when they've learned the hard way, that speaking too loudly gets you uninvited from meetings. The fallout took a few more days to reach full clarity. A senior director pulled me aside, closed his office door, and said, "Whatever you told the audit committee, they took it seriously." I didn't tell them anything, I said. I asked questions. He sighed. Well, they're asking a lot more now. They're doing a full review of capital allocation, and they're not happy about the leaseback terms. Which ones? I asked. All of them? The board couldn't undo the sale. The building belonged to the investment group now, and reversing the transaction would have required money the company didn't have. But they could, and did, initiate an internal restructuring. Some people in finance were moved, others quietly pushed out, and a few were reassigned to compliance where they couldn't hurt anyone. My own manager stepped down a week later, voluntarily, officially. Unofficially, it wasn't hard to read his tired expression as he packed up. He'd been too close to Nate, too willing to nod along, too afraid to question decisions he knew didn't make sense. He shook my hand on his last day. "You always had a clearer view of this place than the rest of us," he said. "Not clearer," I replied, "just closer to the ground." Meanwhile, the landlord sent us the first draft of the new space reconfiguration plan. Smaller footprint, higher rent, more hot desks. It was the physical manifestation of Nate's legacy. A building we no longer owned and a floor plan designed for a company we no longer were. And that's when the decision I'd been circling for weeks finally became real. Leah's client, the one irritated by the office downgrade, reached out again, not to complain this time, to offer something. They were expanding a regional hub and needed someone to oversee operations, retention, and vendor management. Someone with experience structuring leases, managing technical teams, and handling crises without theatrics. Leah forwarded me the message. They asked if you'd be open to a conversation. I told them you might. I didn't jump. I didn't even lean. I just exhaled. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy. I took the meeting, not because I wanted to leave out of spite, but because I finally understood I was the only one in the old company fighting for stability. And stability shouldn't require a martyr. The offer came a week later. A reasonable salary, a sane workload, a modest office in a modest building where no one was trying to perform for investors. I accepted, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly the way doors close when they're aligned properly. When I gave my notice, HR looked almost relieved. "You've been through a lot," they said. "We appreciate your professionalism." I didn't correct them. I didn't remind them that professionalism wasn't what held me there. Responsibility was. Responsibility to people who were now strong enough to stand without me. My team took it better than I expected. Some were sad, some were proud. A few asked if they could join me someday. I told them honestly, build whatever future serves you. Don't wait for someone to hand it to you. My last week was quiet. I documented everything, labeled every cable, left a guide for whoever inherited my chaos. I even walked the building one last time. The hallways, the corners where we'd taken calls at 11 p.m., the kitchen with the dented microwave, the whiteboard still ghosted with a sprint plan from a year ago. It was no longer ours, but it was still familiar. A strange kind of goodbye. The new office was smaller, sunnier, simpler. No glass walls, no branded murals. The chairs didn't match, and the carpet had a stubborn ripple near the door. But the work was honest, the people were grounded, and the space felt exactly what the old one had stopped being. Stable. Leah's client turned out to be the kind of company that cares more about execution than optics. They didn't want me to smile for investors. They wanted me to make sure the lights stayed on and the teams were supported. I could do that. I'd always been able to do that. Every now and then, news from my old company drifted across LinkedIn. A delayed release here, a client churn there, a post from the CEO about rebuilding trust. They were trying. They'd have to. Reputation is slower to repair than drywall. As for the building on 14th and Maple, the new landlord raised the rent right on schedule. The company signed the renewal because they had no leverage. If they'd kept ownership, they could have expanded, negotiated, invested in the space. But that option had been sold off during a moment of vanity, traded for a night of applause that didn't even survive till morning. One afternoon, I passed by the old place on my way to lunch. The windows looked the same. The lobby still had that faint smell of overused HVACs. For a moment, I thought about going inside. I didn't. Some places don't belong to you anymore, no matter how many years you carried the weight of them. I walked back to my new office. The uneven chairs, the imperfect carpet, the people who weren't performing for anyone, and sat down at a desk that wouldn't be sold out from under me. Not for a party, not for optics, not for a man who mistook attention for achievement. They'd sold my office to build his moment in the spotlight. I left with something better, a future he couldn't touch.